You'll be dead before sunset, human. The declaration cut through the humid tension of the Imperium War Academy's survival chamber, where the galaxy's brightest strategists and warriors gathered to witness an execution disguised as a lesson. The air throbbed with the low-energy fields of the observation deck, sending a static-like shiver through the assembled crowd. Commander Dane Varkos adjusted the tactical harness on his chest, rolling his shoulders as though shaking off the weight of expectation. His breath came steady, controlled. He'd faced worse odds before. Across from him, Instructor Verisk Norak, a six-limbed Zelthran war strategist, unfurled a clawed appendage toward the massive laser plasma display projecting a live feed of Trellis V, a planet that wasn't just inhospitable. It was predatory. 72 hours, Norak continued, his elongated pupils constricting to slits. No reinforcements, no evac, no survival structures. You may bring a single item under 5 kilos. The words dripped with smug authority, the kind that came from never being proven wrong. The auditorium of war elites, Krozak tacticians with bio-armored carapaces, Pytherian engineers pulsing with neural modlites, and Uvekian warlords with their intricate throat plates vibrating in low, guttural approval, turned their collective focus to the lone human standing before them. The betting pools had already started. Dane stretched his fingers once, cracked his knuckles, then reached into the equipment vault and pulled out a stick. A ripple of disbelief passed through the gathered aliens, followed by scoffs, a few incredulous murmurs. Norak's pupils widened, a Zelthran equivalent of choking on laughter. Surely this is a joke. Dane turned the stick over in his hands, running his thumb along the grain. Weathered, worn, a piece of earth in his grasp, a survivalist's weapon, a soldier's measuring tool, a reminder of home. He met Norak's gaze head-on. Test begins when? The Zelthran flicked a claw toward the heads-up display. Immediately. A warning klaxon blared through the chamber. The air shuddered as the launch pod engaged, pressurizing for descent. Norak leaned in slightly, his breath cool as solvent gas, voice low and certain. I've sent soldiers with genetic redundancies, exoskeletal plating, subdermal climate modulations. His mandibles flexed. None survived past the first night. Dane exhaled through his nose, not in defiance, not in arrogance, but in understanding. Then you sent the wrong soldiers, and with that the launch pod sealed shut around him, locking him into the most brutal challenge of his life. The drop pod's inertia dampeners strained against the violent pull of Trellis V's gravitational pit, a force twice that of Earth's. Metal groaned, heat plating screeched, external hull temperature spiking as atmospheric drag clawed at the vessel like a living thing. Dane braced, fingers wrapped around the crash harness, counting seconds. Wind shear howled. Static pulses crawled up his spine as the pod system fought against an electromagnetic storm already building along the upper thermals. 20 seconds to impact. The laser plasma display inside the pod flickered erratically as radiation interference spiked. The outside feed fractured into bursts of violet, red, black, ionized dust storms, jagged terrain, the raw fury of a planet designed to devour the unprepared. 15 seconds. A shockwave hit, rolling the pod sideways mid-drop, slamming Dane's shoulder into reinforced plating. His vision blurred with impact tremors, but his focus held. He'd studied the flight trajectory, knew what to expect. 10 seconds. The pod's reinforcement thrusters failed, not unexpected. Anything too advanced, too reliant on structured energy fields, crumbled against Trellis V's electromagnetic distortions. The Imperium engineered the test that way. 5 seconds. Dane curled forward, legs tensed, body angled. Then the ground met him. A brutal collision. The drop pod shattered through a ridge of razor rock, metal screeching, glass bursting in a pressurized implosion. Inside, air was torn from Dane's lungs. Pain fractured through his ribs, blood filled his mouth. His vision flickered with red shadows. Then silence. Not the kind that meant peace. The kind that meant something was waiting. Dane coughed, spitting iron-tinged saliva, rolling onto his side. The impact had ripped open the side of the pod, leaving jagged metal twisted into violent angles, the acrid scent of scorched circuitry seeping into the air. He blinked through red sandstorm haze, his combat visor adjusting for the rapidly shifting atmospheric density. The ground beneath him pulsed faintly. That wasn't good. Pushing to his knees, he gripped the stick, planting it into the unstable terrain. A low vibration rippled through the sediment, traveling up through the wood, into his fingers, mapping the terrain in a way no sensor could. The ridge wasn't solid. Dane pivoted, gaze scanning the ruins of his pod. He had maybe 20 minutes before the electromagnetic fluctuations buried the wreckage in acidic particulate dust. He moved. Dane descended the ridge, keeping low, his breath measured, his movements deliberate. The air wasn't just hot, it was charged. A metallic taste clung to the back of his throat. The atmosphere shifted in pockets, pulling heat in unnatural ways. This planet didn't just kill. It manipulated its victims. Something shifted in the sand ahead. Dane froze, a silhouette, low to the ground, multiple jointed legs, mandibles clacking in arrhythmic pulses. Not a scavenger, a hunter, the lithivore. Dane gripped the stick not like a weapon, but like a probe, an extension of his body, an instrument of understanding. He tapped it lightly against the ground. Once, twice, felt the resonance shift in the sand. The lithivore paused, its sensory filaments flicking outward. It had expected prey to run. Dane did not run. Instead, he angled the stick slightly, adjusting his footing by half a degree. And when the lithivore lunged, expecting human fragility, Dane sidestepped into the trajectory, using the stick to redirect the beast's momentum, shifting the landscape beneath its feet. The predator overshot, its exoskeletal claws catching on unstable sediment, and the ridge collapsed beneath it. The planet ate its own monster. Dane exhaled through his nose, adjusting his grip on the stick. 1 minute on the surface, and he'd already found his first advantage. Above, in the observation deck, Nurak's mandibles parted slightly. His throat plates flickered with something close to unease. Dine Varkos had just arrived on the most dangerous world in the Imperium, and he'd already bent it to his will. The lithivore vanished beneath the crumbling ridge, devoured by the land it had called home. For a second the planet held its breath, the dust settling in uneasy currents, as if Trellis Phi itself had not expected such an outcome. Then the silence cracked. The terrain shifted in protest, responding to the disturbance with a deep subterranean groan that made the ground tremble beneath Dane's boots. He exhaled slowly, eyes tracing the jagged path ahead, measuring what little time he had before the planet adjusted to his presence. He had come down in a bad sector, unstable rock formations, air thick with chemical volatility, thermal currents unpredictable as a madman's temper. The shipwreck behind him was already vanishing beneath layers of choking dust. The heads-up display in his visor flickered in and out, struggling against electromagnetic interference. The Imperium's audience was still watching. He could feel their eyes dissecting his every movement from their cold, metallic seats in the war chamber. Nurak would be perched at the center, arms crossed in that infuriating way, waiting for the inevitable failure. Dane adjusted his grip on the stick. He had minutes, not hours, to move. The terrain sloped downward into a sun-bleached valley, jagged rock spines cutting through the landscape like exposed ribs. He scanned the horizon. Thermal mirages bent the light in warping waves. The sky a fractured prism of burnt gold and violet. 3 suns bore down on him, their combined fury singeing the air, warping distance, tricking the eye. He slid down the ridge, boots grinding against loose sediment. The heat was a living thing, creeping into his lungs, forcing each breath to be a deliberate act. The valley wasn't empty. It was shifting. Pockets of gas release distorted the ground in lazy ripples, like unseen creatures breathing beneath the surface. He'd have to navigate carefully. His earpiece crackled. Nurak's voice, smooth as polished steel, cut through the interference. A clever trick with the lithivore. But even ingenuity has limits. The sun will bleach your bones before nightfall. Dane pressed forward, ignoring the taunt. Words meant nothing out here. He'd learned long ago that survival was about movement, about listening to the land, bending when others broke, adapting before death could take hold. A shadow flickered to his right. His muscles tightened, breath-catching. Not an enemy, not yet. The rock formations cast moving illusions, stretching into shapes that almost felt sentient, shifting as if they too were evaluating him. The stick in his grip pulsed with heat, absorbing the temperature of its new home. He planted it into the ground again, testing. The vibrations ran up the length of wood like whispered warnings. The ground was hollow beneath him. A trap. He stepped back just as a section of the valley floor collapsed inward, revealing a pit lined with calcified spines, the remains of creatures that had fallen victim to the same deception. The pit was deep, shadows pooling at its base like waiting mouths. Nurek's voice returned, dripping with calculated mockery. "Ah, there it is. I was beginning to wonder when Trellis V would make its first move." "Do you feel it yet, Varkos? The understanding that this planet is not your battlefield. It is your executioner." Dane gritted his teeth. He wasn't about to be a spectator in his own death. The pit extended in a natural fault line, running east. If he was going to make it out of the exposed valley, he needed to find higher ground, somewhere to assess the terrain without the ground swallowing him whole. He angled northward toward a section of rock formations that jutted like fractured vertebrae from the earth. His water supply was already running low. He'd expected as much. The real issue would come in another 2 hours when dehydration set in, when his body started tearing itself apart to maintain function. He ran his fingers along his jaw, feeling the grit of sand coating his skin, tasting iron and dust with every breath. His visor was already half useless, distorting data rather than clarifying it. He tapped the side, shutting it off. Raw instinct would serve him better now. He climbed, hand over hand, boots scraping rock, using the stick as a brace to wedge himself upward. His arms burned with effort, but he welcomed the pain. It meant his body was still responding, still fighting. Below, the valley swam in shifting colors, heat distorting depth and shape, making distance impossible to gauge. A guttural chittering echoed from somewhere beneath the rock ledge. Dain stilled. The low vibration wasn't wind, wasn't shifting earth, it was alive. He kept climbing, adjusting his weight, ensuring his movements didn't send vibrations running down the rock face. He needed to reach the peak before... The first talon hooked onto the ledge beneath him. A second. The creature was climbing. Fast. Dane surged upward, pulling himself over the edge of the rock formation just as a blackened shape launched itself up after him. He rolled, twisting, forcing himself onto his feet. It stood on the ledge below, body sleek, elongated exoskeleton gleaming with heat absorption. No eyes. It didn't need them. It had already mapped him, already calculated the number of seconds before it could kill him. Nurek's voice hummed in his ear again, almost amused. "I'd run, if I were you. The Krevkai don't leave bodies. They dismantle them, piece by piece." Dane ignored him. Running meant surrendering control. The Krevkai crouched, muscles shifting in ways that didn't follow standard physics. It was waiting for an opening. Dane gave it one. He let his stance drop, lowering his center of gravity, feigning imbalance. The creature responded instantly, lunging forward, talons slicing the air, already anticipating a fatal strike. At the last moment, Dane angled his weight to the side and drove the stick forward, not as a weapon, but as a disruption. He slammed it into the ground, sending vibrations rippling through the rock, a frequency that bounced back in uneven, unpredictable waves. The Krevkai faltered, its entire body wrenched sideways, its inner balance thrown into chaos. Dane moved, boot to thorax, stick to joint, weight forward. The creature stumbled backward, just enough. One misstep was all it took. The Krevkai plummeted into the pit below, its scream a series of distorted echoes, twisted by the shifting air currents. Dane exhaled once, controlled, lowering the stick. The air still burned. His body ached. The planet still fought to kill him. But he was still standing. In the Imperium's war chamber, Nurek was silent. Dane rolled his shoulders, stretched his fingers. Then he kept moving. Dine Varkos watched the Krevkai disappear into the pit, its scream bending with the wind, dissolving into the living silence of Trellis V. He stayed still, listening to the planet breathe. The rock beneath him vibrated, absorbing the death like a pulse in a living body, adjusting to the absence. The ecosystem didn't just react, it adapted. He had to do the same. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the strain in his muscles, the raw heat clinging to his skin like an unseen predator. The terrain ahead stretched in jagged formations, stones scorched black by solar exposure, fractured in places where the ground had warped from sudden pressure shifts. His earpiece crackled. Nurak again, voice low, deliberate. "You're efficient, but efficiency won't outpace inevitability. You're burning energy faster than you're replenishing it. The body always loses before the mind does." Dane dragged the back of his hand across his forehead. Nurak wasn't wrong. His hydration levels were dropping, and his body had already begun stripping reserves. Dehydration would hit him before the planet got the chance. He gripped the stick tighter. He needed water, needed shelter, needed something Trellis V had no intention of giving. His gaze swept the terrain, searching for an anomaly, something that broke the planet's cruel symmetry. He climbed higher along the rock face, boots grinding against unstable sediment, dust coating his throat with every breath. Movement, a flicker in the distance, not wind, not shifting heat distortion. This was different, a rhythm, not a reaction. He crouched lower, adjusting his visor manually. The laser plasma display flickered as it struggled to process real-time data against the electromagnetic interference. A formation jutted from the canyon ahead, fractured in tapered ridges, like overlapping plates. But the way the light shifted off its surface, it wasn't mineral. Chitin. Dain exhaled slowly. He had two choices: go around and risk dehydration, or approach and risk something worse. The wind picked up, curling heat around his body, reminding him that hesitation on Trellis V was just another way of dying. He moved. The ridges grew sharper as he closed the distance. Organic plates shifting slightly, reflecting light in unnatural ways. A nest. Not the way a predator nests. This was structured, layered, purposeful. He crouched near an outcrop, studying the exterior. The chitinous shell pulsed faintly, almost as if it were breathing, feeding off the ambient heat. No entry points. No obvious seams in the structure. Dain slid his fingers against the rock beneath his boots. The ground vibrated. A pattern, subtle, calculated, not erratic like the lithivores. This was intelligence. He planted the stick lightly into the dust and listened. The vibrations weren't just traveling through the terrain, they were echoing. He wasn't near a nest. He was standing on top of one. The ground trembled. Dane pushed back just as the surface beneath him fractured outward. A shape burst through the sediment, sleek, segmented limbs, plated exoskeleton absorbing the sun's radiation in a dull, light-consuming gleam. Krevkai. More of them. But this one didn't lunge. It hovered at the breach, legs tensed, head tilting slightly. Studying him, Dane slowly straightened. This wasn't a hunter. This was something else. The earpiece crackled. Nurak's voice dropped to a murmur. "That's not a drone. That's a strategist." Dane's grip on the stick tightened. "They have strategists? All apex species do. The difference is, humans usually assume they're the only ones." The Krevkai clicked its mandibles once, twice. Then the vibrations under Dane's feet shifted, turning into something deeper, a signal. The ground split wider and more of them surfaced, moving with deliberate coordination. Not rushing, not attacking, encircling. Dane inhaled slowly. Trellis V wasn't just trying to kill him anymore. It was measuring him. He adjusted his stance, shifting his weight slightly, calculating his next step. But the Krevkai strategist had already moved first. It mimicked his movement, a fraction of a second delay, analyzing his response, dissecting his reactions in real time. Dane exhaled through his nose. They weren't testing his strength. They were testing his process. The war chamber's heads-up displays flickered with an influx of betting pools shifting. Nurak exhaled, a low, contemplative vibration in his throat. "They're building a playbook on you. If they understand you, they can counter you. If they counter you, They don't have to kill you. They can break you first. Dain didn't look away from the strategist. Smart, but there's a flaw. Nurak's voice remained unreadable. Oh? Dain shifted again, adjusting his posture just slightly, letting the Krevkai mirror him, letting it settle into expectation. Then he moved wrong, a half-step that made no sense, a decision that went against every combat instinct. The Krevkai hesitated, a fraction of a second, but a fraction was all he needed. Dain drove the stick forward, planting it against the edge of the breach, using his full weight to shift the terrain. The loose sediment caved under the imbalance, a chain reaction of collapsing ground, sending the outer Krevkai skidding backward, their footing lost. The strategist caught itself, limbs snapping outward for stabilization, but the others weren't as fast. Dain was already moving, seizing the opening, vaulting over the disrupted edge of the pit. He landed hard, rolling once before pushing back onto his feet, already sprinting for higher ground. He didn't have time to kill them. That wasn't the game. The game was not being understood. The canyon sloped upward into an unnatural formation, a sheer rock face, shadowed at the base, giving the illusion of a dead end. But Dain had seen the trick already. The terrain wasn't solid. It was layered. He sprinted toward the rock, ignoring the vibrations that signaled the Krevkai had recalibrated, that they were closing in again, their delay already accounted for. Dain didn't slow. He angled his run, gripping the stick like a lever, using the terrain's instability against itself. He hit the rock wall at an angle, transferring momentum upward, using the fractured stone as a brief foothold before launching off the surface again. He caught a ledge, pulled himself up, kept climbing, kept moving. Below, the Krevkai reached the dead end, paused, watching, not climbing. Dain pulled himself over the ridge, lungs burning, muscles shaking with exhaustion. His arms ached, his ribs throbbed. His body was failing, even if his mind refused to acknowledge it. He collapsed onto his back, staring up at Trellis V's sky, the three suns bleeding color into each other, staining the horizon with unnatural light. The planet had made its move, and it had learned something new. Dain let his eyes close for just a second, exhaling. He had too. Dain's heartbeat thundered against his ribs, the rapid climb leaving his muscles screaming for relief. His breath came in sharp pulls, raw against the dry air. He forced himself onto his elbows, scanning the landscape from his new vantage point. Every movement felt like dragging himself through molten glass, his body protesting each shift. Below, the Krevkai strategist stood motionless, the lower ridges of its throat vibrating in some unknown rhythm. Its counterparts spread out along the dead end, skittering between the rock formations, limbs curling, unraveling, waiting. But they weren't following. Dain wiped the sweat from his brow, the heat settling into his bones like a living thing, wrapping around him, draining him. He had pushed them, forced them to react in a way they hadn't anticipated, but that wouldn't last. He could feel the weight of their calculations, an intelligence mapping him out in real time. His earpiece sparked to life, Nurak's voice pressing through the static. Interesting. They aren't pursuing. Dain exhaled, his jaw tight. They don't need to. They already got what they wanted. Nurak's silence carried an edge. And what's that? Dain shifted his weight, forcing his aching muscles to comply. A second draft. The strategist below tilted its head, throat clicking once, a sound that felt like acknowledgement. The Krevkai weren't just hunting. They were learning. Dain pushed himself upright, dragging the stick across the fractured rock, letting the vibrations run through his palm. He wasn't safe yet, not even close. He had forced their hand once, but survival didn't come from a single move. It came from changing the entire game. The wind shifted. A new sound rolled across the horizon, not from the Krevkai. Something else, something massive. Dain turned toward the distant ridges. The air trembled, the rock beneath him vibrating like a struck drumhead. Whatever was approaching wasn't moving like the Krevkai. This wasn't calculation. This was dominance. Nurak's voice returned, slower this time. You might want to move. Dain's pulse kicked up. Nurak had been smug since the moment he'd landed. Not anymore. The ground split open. Something erupted from the canyon's depths. A monolithic form, its exoskeleton dull black, not from color but from sheer density, a thing designed to consume light rather than reflect it. It was colossal, not just in size but in presence, in the sheer force of its arrival. The canyon walls buckled under the impact of its emergence, sending cracks rippling outward in waves of seismic protest. Dain barely kept his footing as the landscape rebelled. The Krevkai reacted instantly. They didn't attack. They folded, bodies lowering, limbs curling inward in a coordinated, almost ritualistic deference. This wasn't a predator. This was a king. Dain stepped back. His throat felt thick with unspoken calculations, his survival instinct screaming before his logic could catch up. The Krevkai weren't the apex of Trellis V. This was. The creature turned its head. A slow, deliberate movement, the kind made by things that had never once known fear. Its multi-layered mandibles unfolded slightly, revealing an interior structure that seemed to shift between organic and metallic. Something evolved beyond the need for separation between the two. Dain forced himself to stay still, to listen, to watch. He had never encountered a species like this. No one had. The Imperium's files on Trellis V were detailed, but this thing wasn't in them. Nurak exhaled into the mic. That was not expected. Dain didn't look away. You sound nervous. A low chuckle, hollow. I'm reevaluating my bets. The Colossus finally moved. Not toward him, but toward the Krevkai. The strategist remained lowered, its entire body unreadable, its throat vibrations now barely audible. The Colossus reached out. Not an attack, but something closer to an examination. Dain's mind worked fast. The Krevkai weren't prey. They were subjects. The Colossus wasn't just a higher predator. It was something else. Something that saw. He stepped back again, adjusting his grip on the stick. The vibration against his palm was chaotic now, too many frequencies overlapping, too much interference. Whatever was happening, the planet itself was reacting to it. Then the Colossus turned, not fully, just enough. Its body angled toward him, acknowledging him. The canyon was silent. Dain inhaled slowly. It wasn't just looking at him. It was deciding something. His earpiece crackled, Nurak's voice now barely above a whisper. Don't move! Dain ignored him. He took a step forward, a single step. The Colossus stilled. Dain lifted the stick slightly, just enough to let the vibrations shift again, to see if it reacted, if it processed him the way the Krevkai had. Nothing. Then, the Colossus let out a sound, not a roar, not an attack, a single resonating pulse. The Krevkai flinched. Dain did not. Nurak exhaled. That's new. Dain swallowed. What did I just start? The Colossus shifted its weight, mandibles clicking twice, then, without warning, it retreated. Not in fear, not in submission, in choice. The canyon trembled once more as the creature disappeared into the depths. The Krevkai remained still. Dain finally let out the breath he'd been holding. Nurak spoke again, his voice quiet but sharp. That thing wasn't hunting you. Dain flexed his fingers, feeling the weight of the stick against his palm, the ground beneath him still carrying the remnants of that final vibration. No. He turned, gaze locked on the now empty canyon, on the layers of shifting dust settling like an unspoken omen. It was watching. Dain Varkos remained motionless long after the Colossus had vanished, his fingers pressed against the warm dirt, feeling the residual tremors bleed into silence. The air hung thick with something unspoken, an absence that carried more weight than the creature's presence had. This planet wasn't just alive. It was watching, calculating, choosing. His grip tightened around the stick, its surface now smoothed by his own sweat, his own persistence. He knew what it meant to be measured, to be assessed as a variable rather than an anomaly. Trellis V had shifted its attention, and that meant Dain had moved from a survivor to something else entirely. His earpiece crackled. Nurak's voice slid through, quieter this time. What did it see in you? Dane exhaled slowly. Not sure yet. Nurak hesitated, an uncharacteristic pause before he responded. That's worse than an answer. Dane adjusted his stance, shaking the tension from his limbs, ignoring the dry burn in his throat, the growing weight in his bones. He needed water, needed shelter. But more than that, he needed a plan. The Krevkai were still watching. They hadn't moved since the Colossus had left. Their strategist remained crouched in the sand, those unblinking slits in its head angled upward, tracking him with an unreadable stillness. They weren't attacking. They were waiting. Dane tested the ground again with the stick, rolling the vibrations through his fingertips. The terrain ahead sloped downward, deeper into the canyon's bones, toward a place where the heat wasn't moving with the wind but sinking into the rock itself. A basin. That meant there was a chance, a slim one, but a chance nonetheless, that somewhere beneath the layers of brutalized stone, there was water. Dane pivoted, pushing forward. The Krevkai shifted, not following, not stopping him, just marking his departure. Nurak clicked his mandibles over the channel. They're letting you go. That should worry you. Dane kept his focus on the path ahead. Everything about this place worries me, but standing still is worse. He descended, the temperature dipping fractionally as the canyon wall stretched higher, trapping the light between layers of sediment. The air pressed in differently here, thicker, damp with something that carried the faint taste of minerals against the back of his teeth. There it was, the first sign. He ran his fingers along the rock face, tracing the faint grooves where moisture had once carved its path. Not recently, but not so long ago that the land had forgotten. A shift in the dirt ahead. Dane stilled, adjusting his weight, muscles coiled. He wasn't alone. Something moved between the rock formations, just out of reach of his periphery. Not the Krevkai, not the Colossus. Something else. He tightened his grip on the stick, lowering his stance. Whatever it was hunting. The air shifted again, but not from movement, from temperature. Dane felt the change before he heard it. The subtle drop, the way the heat retreated, not from shade, but from displacement. The stone beneath his boots cooled too quickly. Then, a shape uncoiled from the canyon wall, not a shadow, not rock. Something that had been waiting. It struck fast. A blur of segmented movement, limbs snapping outward, an exoskeletal monstrosity that had camouflaged itself against the sediment until the moment of attack. Dane dropped low, pivoting hard, the stick angled as a deflection point, forcing the creature's momentum to carry past instead of into him. He barely had time to process its structure. It wasn't a Krevkai. It was something older, something bred for ambush rather than pursuit. The creature twisted midair, retracting into itself like a coil springing back into tension. It hadn't miscalculated its strike. It was testing. Dane exhaled sharply. Of course, more learning. Nurak's voice came clipped through the channel. What are you dealing with? Dane adjusted his grip. Don't know yet, but it's smart enough to feint. The creature lunged again. This time Dane didn't dodge. He angled the stick differently, the way he had when testing the vibrations before. Not as a weapon, as an instrument. The creature reacted. Not to him. To the change in the frequency of impact. It withdrew, limbs shifting, recalibrating. Dane's pulse kicked up. They're all connected. Nurak hesitated. Explain. Dane took a slow step back, keeping his breathing controlled. They're not just different species. They're components, variations. If the Krevkai were the foot soldiers and that Colossus was the ruler, this is the assassin. Nurak was silent for a moment. Then, so what does that make you? Dane's jaw locked. I guess we're about to find out. The assassin tensed again. Not to attack, to retreat. Dane didn't chase it. That wasn't the game. He turned back to the rock formation, pressing his fingers into the grooves. The moisture here had been moved recently, not by nature, by something deliberate, a hidden reservoir. He ran his palm over the surface, applying pressure, feeling for the weak point. Then, using the stick, he struck. The rock face fractured outward, a controlled break, releasing a rush of cool, mineral-laden air, the scent of wet stone and ancient water spilling out into the canyon's heat. Dane pressed forward, entering the new space, letting his eyes adjust. Water, not much, but enough. And along the far wall, not natural formations, structures, built. Dane inhaled slowly. Well, that's unexpected. Nurak's voice carried a new weight. That's impossible. Dane stepped forward, dragging his fingers along the edge of what could only be artificial design. The material was old, but not decayed. This planet wasn't uninhabited. Not entirely. Dane exhaled. Looks like Trellis V has a history. Nurak's tone turned sharp. And if it has a history... Dane finished the thought for him. It has ghosts. Dane pressed his palm against the structure's surface, feeling the cold bite of something that shouldn't exist on Trellis V. The material wasn't natural rock. It was worked, shaped by hands or appendages unknown. Age had eroded its edges, but the structure itself remained, a silent relic buried in a grave of shifting sand and time. His pulse steadied. This was no accident. The water wasn't a fluke. Someone, or something, had been here before. He reached out again, dragging his fingers along the grooves, searching for a pattern, for an answer. The material hummed beneath his touch. Not sound, but a vibration, a presence of something lingering just beyond recognition. Nurak's voice cut through his earpiece, sharper now. Say that again. Dane exhaled. It's built, not natural. Someone made this. The war chamber's laser plasma displays flickered with the information feed, betting pools grinding to a sudden, silent halt. Even Nurak, who had spent the past day taunting him, seemed unnerved. Impossible. Trellis V was never settled. It's a graveyard. Dane stepped back, scanning the interior of the chamber. It wasn't large, maybe 3 meters wide, 6 deep, but it was deliberate. The walls sloped inward, leading to something half buried in the sediment. He crouched, brushing the loose dust aside. His fingers traced symbols. Not human, not Krevkai. Older. The air inside the space was cooler, damp with the remnants of a hidden reservoir, each breath carrying the weight of history, of absence. The space felt untouched, not abandoned, as if whoever had been here never left by choice. The Krevkai had not followed him in. Dain set the stick against the wall and studied the markings following their flow. They weren't just decorative, they were instructional, a sequence, a message left behind. Nurak's voice returned, this time with something close to curiosity. What are you seeing? Dane ran his fingers over the engravings, following the direction they pointed. Instructions, or a warning, or both. He followed the etchings to the farthest wall where the stone was darker, more refined, untouched by the sand's slow erosion. Embedded in the center, half obscured by the passage of time, was an indentation shaped for something to fit within it. Dane frowned. A missing piece. The wind shifted outside. Something had changed. He moved back toward the entrance, glancing up toward the ridgeline. The sky beyond the canyon had darkened, not from the coming night but from movement. Shadows twisted across the upper terrain. Not clouds, not another colossus. The Krevkai had company. Nurak's tone shifted, taking on the edge of an officer assessing a battlefield. You need to move, now. Dain adjusted his grip on the stick. What am I looking at? A pause. Something I don't recognize. And I don't like not recognizing things. Dain pushed out of the chamber, stepping into the cooling canyon air. Above, figures lined the ridge, shapes wrapped in plates of unfamiliar armor, their silhouettes blurred by the refracted light of the dying sun. They weren't Krevkai. They weren't human. Dain felt the weight of their gaze settle on him, not just observation, a confirmation. One of them stepped forward, raising something, not a weapon but an object, something angular, metallic, something that caught the light and refracted it back in shifting patterns. Dane's stomach turned cold. He recognized the shape, the missing piece. The realization settled like iron in his bones. These weren't just observers. They were the architects of the ruin below, and they had just found their trespasser. The Krevkai had known. That's why they hadn't followed him. They hadn't needed to, because he was never supposed to leave this place alive. Nurak's voice came low, almost unreadable. "Dane, whatever happens next..." The figures moved. The canyon erupted into motion. Dane turned, sprinting toward the rock wall, scanning for an escape. He needed high ground, a vantage point, but the only way out was up. He dug the stick into the crevice between two plates of sediment, launching himself upward, boots scrambling for purchase. The rock cut into his palms, his body burned with exhaustion. But he climbed. There was no other choice. The first impact hit the wall beside him. Not a bullet, not an energy pulse, but something worse. The rock cracked inward, the sediment crystallizing on contact, the structure warping as if the material itself was being rewritten. Dane didn't look down. He pulled, reached, climbed. The figures below followed at an unnatural pace, moving with an efficiency that didn't belong to organic life. They weren't just fast, they were inevitable. Dane shoved himself over the ledge, rolling onto his back, chest heaving. The air was thinner here, colder. He forced himself upright. The Krevkai were gone. Not fled, not dead, gone. He looked down into the canyon. The structures below were still there, the markings still carved into the rock. But the chamber? Sealed, as if it had never existed. Nurak's voice came back, strained. "Dane, tell me what you're seeing." Dane exhaled. I think I just saw something rewrite reality." A beat of silence. Then, "That's not possible." Dane looked back at the ridge where the figures had been. They were gone. Only the wind remained. He let his head tilt back, staring at the sky above Trellis V, the stars scattered like broken glass across a void that suddenly felt much, much deeper. He swallowed hard. "It is now." Dane stood at the edge of the ridge, eyes locked on the shifting light where the figures had once stood. The wind had swallowed their presence, leaving only the eerie quiet of a battlefield between battles. But he knew better than to trust silence. He exhaled slowly, pressing his palm into the dirt, feeling for the vibrations beneath him. The terrain carried memory, the echoes of what had just unfolded. The structures beneath the canyon floor were still there, buried but not forgotten. The architects of those ruins hadn't erased him. Not yet. Nurak's voice slid through the static of his earpiece, quieter than before. "Tell me what's happening." Dane wiped the dust from his face, knuckles brushing against the deep grooves in his skin. His muscles ached, his breath still held the sharp edge of exertion, but his mind was already moving forward. "They didn't chase me." A beat of silence. Then Nurak exhaled. "That should worry you." Dane ran his fingers over the cracks in the rock, measuring the depth. No pursuit meant one of two things. They either didn't care, or they were waiting for him to step back into their trap. He had to assume the latter. His grip tightened around the stick. Trellis V wasn't trying to kill him anymore. It was studying him, and that meant it was time to stop playing defense. He crouched, drawing a rough grid into the sand, mapping the terrain based on what he had felt through the stick. The structures were part of something bigger, something beneath the surface. There had to be a pattern, weak points in the foundation, vent shafts, fault lines where erosion had weakened the layers. If they controlled the battlefield, he had to change the battlefield. Nurak's voice sharpened. "Whatever you're thinking, it's reckless." Dane adjusted his stance, tapping the rock once, letting the vibrations run through his fingertips. "Survival's not about playing it safe. It's about making sure the other guy doesn't get a second shot." He needed to set the terms, take the high ground and force them to move where he wanted them. The ridge was unstable, weakened by thousands of years of planetary shifts. If he could trigger a controlled collapse, it would force them into a position where their advantage, their ability to manipulate the field itself, became useless. He positioned keystones along the slope, moving deliberately, setting up a cascading failure. One strike in the right place would send the whole thing down, turning their ground into their grave. Then he waited. They would return. They had erased the chamber. They would come back to erase him. The first distortion rippled through the air, a shimmer where light bent the wrong way. where the planet itself seemed to hold its breath. Dane tensed. They were back. He didn't move, didn't breathe. Let them think he was cornered. Let them believe the game was still theirs. Figures materialized, stepping forward with the same unnatural grace, their silhouettes blurred by refracted light. One of them raised a hand, the same motion as before, the same reality-warping effect beginning to ripple outward. Dane struck. The stick slammed into the weakest point of the ridge, a single, calculated impact that sent the first tremor tearing through the canyon. The ground beneath their feet groaned, a slow, deep sound like something ancient exhaling. The figures hesitated. For the first time, they weren't in control. Dane stepped back, the landslide unfolding in slow motion. Stone cracked, sediment caved inward, the entire canyon beginning to fold in on itself. The architects moved, but too late. The terrain wasn't theirs anymore. The first figure collapsed beneath the cascade, swallowed by falling debris. Another twisted mid-step, trying to escape, but the ground crumbled beneath its weight, pulling it down. Dane turned and ran. The ridge was falling, the land tearing itself apart in a violent cascade of stone and gravity. He sprinted toward higher ground, leaping over cracks, dodging falling debris. The last impact hit. The canyon collapsed completely, sealing whatever had been below, beneath thousands of tons of rock. Dane didn't stop running until he reached stable ground. He braced against a stone, his breath tearing through his lungs, his entire body screaming for rest. No movement, no pursuit, only silence. He looked back at the ruins. Buried. Nurak's voice returned, quiet but unreadable. "Do you think they're dead?" Dane wiped the sweat from his brow, fingers pressing into the dirt. "I don't care." He straightened, the weight of the stick familiar in his hands, the warmth of it grounding. They had erased his presence before. This time, he had erased them. If they came back, he would bury more than ruins. Dine Varkos stood atop the fractured ridge, staring down at the ruins he had buried. The dust had not yet settled, and neither had the war. The planet was still watching, still shifting beneath him like a living thing, its intent unknowable. The figures that had emerged from nothing were now trapped beneath a tomb of their own making. Or at least, that was what he had to believe. The stick in his grip felt heavier now, slick with sweat. The wood warmed from the heat of his own survival. An instrument, a weapon, a lifeline. He had waged war against something that was never supposed to be fought. And he was still here. Nurak's voice cut through the static of his earpiece, slow, deliberate. "You should be dead," Dane exhaled, rolling his shoulders, the exhaustion pressing into his bones like an old wound. "Yeah, I get that a lot." There was a pause, longer than Nurak had ever allowed. The Zelthran strategist was always waiting with a retort, always prepared with a calculated jab. But now, there was only silence. And then, something worse. A quiet, unsettled truth. "The betting pool is gone," Nurak said finally. Dane frowned, scanning the shifting horizon. "What do you mean, gone?" Nurak's throat clicked, a sound of uncertainty that had no place in his usual arrogance. "I mean erased. Wiped from the records, as if it never existed. No one's placing odds on your survival anymore, Varkos, because they don't know what to bet against." Dane tightened his grip on the stick. The battlefield was changing, and this time it wasn't just Trellis V adapting. It was the Imperium. "They're afraid." Nurak hesitated. "Number, they're waiting." The weight of those words settled deep in Dane's gut. Waiting for what? For him to fail? For Trellis V to finish what it started? Or for him to do something worse? He glanced down at his feet. The ground had stopped trembling. No more distant echoes of buried things shifting beneath the surface. No movement. No resistance. That meant one of two things. He had won, or something had changed the rules entirely. He looked up at the sky. 3 suns hung in the upper atmosphere, their combined light bathing the landscape in a color that didn't exist anywhere else in the galaxy. The light had always burned too hot, too sharp, turning everything into a shifting mirage. But now Now it looked clearer. Nurek's voice returned, softer this time. "What do you see?" Dane flexed his fingers, dragging his boot through the dust, feeling the weight of the planet beneath him. "Nothing, and that's what's bothering me." He had spent the last 72 hours fighting for every breath, every step. Now, standing here, staring at an open sky, he felt something he hadn't since his boots first hit Trellis V's soil: stillness. That was wrong. Trellis V had never been still. Nurek's voice sharpened, the war strategist taking over. "The Krevkai?" Dain scanned the terrain. Not a single shadow moved. The creatures that had once hunted him, studied him, tested his instincts. They were gone. He had buried the figures beneath the canyon, but the Krevkai, they had vanished on their own. "They're not here." Nurek's mandibles clicked. "That doesn't mean they're dead." Dain ran his tongue along the inside of his cheek, eyes narrowing at the emptiness stretching ahead of him. This wasn't victory. This was evacuation. Something had pushed them back. Something had made them leave. The air was too light. The heat, though still oppressive, lacked the crushing, calculated suffocation of before. The landscape no longer felt like it was watching. Dain exhaled slowly. "I think I broke something." Nurek didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice carried a note that Dain had never heard before. "Then I suggest you leave before you find out what it was." Dain rolled his shoulders, glancing back toward the canyon one last time. The debris was still settling, dust clinging to the air like the remnants of a battlefield that refused to be forgotten. And then, in the distance, something shifted. Not movement, not sound. A presence. He felt it before he saw it. An ache in the back of his skull. A pressure that didn't belong. It wasn't physical. It wasn't even real in the way the Krevkai had been real. But it was there, watching. Dain inhaled slowly, adjusting his grip on the stick. His body screamed for rest, but his mind was already moving. He had no intention of waiting to see what came next. "Get me an evac point." Nurek didn't argue, didn't gloat, didn't even hesitate. "Already sent. 5 clicks east. Don't stop moving." Dain turned toward the horizon, setting one boot in front of the other, forcing his body into motion. The battle was over. But the war? The war had just started. The Imperium had sent him here to prove humanity's limitations. Instead, he had rewritten the rules of survival itself. Trellis V had tried to erase him. Now the entire galaxy would have to reckon with the fact that they had failed. The wind curled around him, carrying something almost like laughter, almost like recognition. Dain smirked. Let them watch. Let them see what happened when a human decided the impossible was just another challenge. He adjusted his grip on the stick and kept walking. The first human to survive Trellis V, and maybe, just maybe, the last.